Ceruse Queen, The True Cost of Immortality by Kerry Clark, part of the Heinous History historical fiction short story series. Elizabeth I never married, never gave birth, never aged, at least not in public. Chapter 1. She couldn't blink. Elizabeth's eyes watered, her lids quivered with the effort, but she remained statue still, as Lady Margaret leaned in with the small porcelain pot of Venetian ceruse. Her breath ghosted over Elizabeth's face, warm with cloves and something sour. Perhaps wine turned bad, or the ghost of last night's meat pie. Elizabeth fought against the urge to flinch. The scent of the ceruse hit her nostrils next, a sharp, chalky rot beneath the rose oil that had been added to mask its true nature. The brush hovered inches from her face, waiting for that perfect moment of stillness. Majesty, if you would just... Queens don't blink, Elizabeth snapped. The words came out harsher than she meant them to be, and she saw Lady Margaret's shoulders tense. Continue, she added more softly. The brush descended, cold and wet, against her skin. Another layer. The 45th year of her reign, and what must be the 1000th, no 10,000th? Application of white lead paste to her royal face. The mixture's familiar vinegar sting made her nostrils flare, but still she refused to flinch. Outside her chamber windows, thunder grumbled across the Thames like an old man's complaints. Inside, her face was its own battlefield. White lead, vinegar, and denial waging a daily war against the relentless march of time. Lady Margaret worked methodically, with gentle hands, filling the cracks that had formed overnight. The Queen's skin had begun cracking more frequently of late, like the lacquer on an aging reliquary kept too close to the fire. "Shall I add more to the left cheek, Your Majesty?" Margaret asked, her voice carefully neutral, though Elizabeth could hear the concern beneath. The markings are somewhat visible today. Elizabeth knew exactly which markings Margaret meant. The pockmarks. Almost 30 years since the smallpox had nearly claimed her life, and still they defied her. Little craters, tiny mutinies, constant reminders that even queens could be marred by mere disease. "Make me ageless," she whispered, so softly that Margaret had to lean in closer. "Or make me a goddamned ghost." Margaret's brush froze mid-air. The Queen rarely cursed. "I beg your pardon, Majesty." Elizabeth's painted lips stretched into the practiced smile that had charmed ambassadors and terrified Spanish admirals for decades. "Nothing, dear Margaret. Just an old woman's fancy." Elizabeth straightened her back. "Another layer, and make it thick. I'm to meet the Spanish ambassador at noon, and I'd like him to remember exactly what I looked like when I sank his countrymen." Margaret nodded, mixing more white powder with vinegar in the little dish. The resulting paste gleamed wetly, pearl white in the dim chamber light streaming through the mullioned windows. 15 years ago, Elizabeth added, almost to herself, remembering the triumph against the armada that had made her name echo through Europe. "Exactly so, Your Majesty," Margaret said, careful to ignore the impossibility of a 70-year-old queen looking as she did at 55. As the brush resumed its work, Elizabeth stared at her reflection in the silver-backed mirror. Her red wig, not the grand court one with the jewels, but the morning one, itched abominably against her scalp. Underneath, her own hair had thinned to wisps, brittle and colourless as winter grass. "The perfect canvas for reinvention," she told herself. Wasn't that what queenship was, after all? Reinvention, performance, mask upon mask? A droplet of ceruse slid down her temple, resembling nothing so much as a tear tracking through the white powder. "Careful," she murmured. "We're making a masterpiece here." "Yes, Your Majesty. Always," Margaret replied, dabbing away the errant drop with a cloth before it could stain the Queen's ruff. Chapter 2. The presence chamber shimmered with late sunlight, gilding every surface in gold. Elizabeth appeared untouchable as she entered, a living statue of monarchy divine. Her entrance was timed to the breath, her embroidered train arranged just so, her jewels catching the light at carefully calculated angles. The Spanish ambassador waited near the throne dais, his expression a mask nearly as practiced as her own. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing low, his dark beard nearly touching the polished floor. "King Philip sends his warmest regards." Elizabeth's laugh rang out, sudden and sharp. The surrounding courtiers stiffened, then relaxed into nervous titters when they saw the smile on their queen's face. "Does he indeed? How very Christian of him, considering how warmly his armada greeted our shores." Her voice carried across the chamber, ensuring everyone present heard the barb. The ambassador's smile tightened, though he maintained his composure. "That unpleasantness is long past, Majesty. Spain looks to the future, as do we, Senor, though we find my memory remains inconveniently intact." She tapped her temple with one jeweled finger. "Particularly when it comes to threats against my realm." She moved among her courtiers afterward, playing the familiar game, teasing young Lord Essex about his newly sprouted beard, which he stroked proudly whenever he thought no one was looking, complimenting Lady Howard's imported brocade gown, while mentally estimating its ruinous cost and wondering if the Howard finances could truly support such extravagance. She nodded graciously at Sir Walter Raleigh's latest sonnet in her honor, even though her mind was elsewhere, calculating the political implications of the Spanish ambassador's visit. "My Lord of Salisbury," she called, eyeing Robert Cecil's diminutive form as he stood conversing with the French envoy. "You're looking uncommonly dapper today. Is that a silver thread we spy among the sable?" Cecil touched his neatly trimmed beard, self-consciously. "Your Majesty has keener eyes than I." "We jest, Robert. But should you find one, consider yourself fortunate. Grey hairs are badges of survival." She leaned closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "Had our father lived to see one, perhaps England might have avoided certain zealous reforms." Cecil nodded, his shrewd eyes studying her face. Too closely. Elizabeth turned away, pretending a sudden interest in a Flemish tapestry that showed Judith beheading Holofernes, the biblical heroine's face set in grim determination as she saved her people. The day's performance stretched endlessly, each hour requiring more effort than the last. By the time she retreated to her private chambers, her jaw ached from smiling, her back from perfect posture, her soul from the constant vigilance of being Elizabeth Regina rather than just Elizabeth, the woman who had once been a princess, then a prisoner, before becoming queen. "Will you take supper, Your Majesty?" Lady Margaret asked, helping to remove the elaborate court wig with gentle hands. Elizabeth shook her head, feeling the weight lift from her scalp. Later, perhaps. Food had tasted like metal for weeks now. Everything tasted of blood or copper, a symptom she refused to mention to her physicians. They'd only suggest bloodletting, their answer to everything from melancholy to plague. "You've scarcely eaten today," Margaret said, with the cautious insistence of one who had earned her place and feared losing it. "I've scarcely had time," Elizabeth countered, massaging her temples where the wig had pressed the most. "Tomorrow I have another portrait sitting with that Flemish fellow. What's his name? The one with the unfortunate nose." "Master Gerat's Majesty." "Yes, him. Majesty is maintenance, Margaret, and I am maintaining." She gestured to her face, still covered in the white paste. "Now, help me to bed. But leave the ceruse. We'll touch it up in the morning." Later, alone in her vast bed with its heavy brocade hangings smelling faintly of lavender and rosemary, Elizabeth stared into darkness. Her skin felt tight, itching beneath the layer of white lead that had become more familiar to her than her own complexion. Her pillowcase would be dusted white by morning, smudged like chalk on parchment. The ceruse always left its traces. She touched her face, feeling the slight crackle of the dried paste. Underneath, her skin had peeled, tender and raw in places. A small price for immortality, she told herself. For England. For the Virgin Queen who must never wither, never decay. Elizabeth the woman could fade. The Queen must not. Chapter 3. A gift, Your Majesty, said the French ambassador, sweeping into a bow so deep it bordered on parody, his silk doublet rustling with the movement. From His Most Christian Majesty, King Henri. Elizabeth smiled with practiced radiance as the silk-wrapped package was brought forward by two liveried servants. Relations with France were fragile things these days, delicate as spun glass. Henry's recent embrace of Catholicism might have soothed the streets of Paris, but it made Elizabeth's blood curdle with memories of her sister Mary's burning times. "How very thoughtful," she said, lifting one hand in a queenly flick toward Lady Margaret. "Let us see what piety looks like when wrapped in silk." The silks slipped free, revealing a gilded mirror framed in carved fleur-de-lis and tucked like secrets between the curls. Tudor roses, a diplomatic touch. The glass was unnaturally clear, its surface smooth as ice, without the soft warping common in even the finest English-made mirrors. His Majesty thought the Queen of England might enjoy seeing what all Europe admires, the ambassador said. His French accent softened the edges of the words just enough to make the insult elegant rather than obvious. Elizabeth's smile stayed pinned in place, a mask lacquered in civility. "Convey our thanks to King Henry. Self-reflection is indeed a royal virtue." But she didn't look into the glass. Not then, with dozens of eyes watching, waiting to pounce on any flicker of doubt, any hint of vanity or, worse, mortality. Later that night, Elizabeth lit only one candle in her bedchamber. It threw long shadows against the walls of her private chamber, making the tapestry seem to move with spectral life. She sat before the French king's gift, positioning it so the flame struck her square in the face. Then she looked. The image didn't blink back. For a breathless moment, the mirror showed only the room, its candlelight, its shadows, its emptiness. No queen. But no, there she was. Composed, motionless, perfect control. Queens did not blink. Queens did not fidget. Queens did not reveal weakness. Her breath snagged in her throat. The mirror had betrayed her. Her carefully constructed face was cracking. Not just the typical end-of-day fissures in the ceruse, but something deeper. Her left eye drooped slightly at the corner. Her lips, painted vivid crimson, seemed uneven, the right corner trembling minutely. And beneath the whiteness, her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that no amount of lead paste could truly conceal. "Make me ageless," she whispered to her reflection. "Or make me a goddamned ghost." This time, there was no lady in waiting to hear, no need to retract the blasphemy. Just Elizabeth and her reflection, locked in mutual assessment like two chess players considering the board. She covered the mirror with its silk wrappings and called for wine. When it came, brought by a sleepy-eyed serving girl, it tasted of metal and rust, but she drank it anyway, hoping it might dull the throbbing pain in her temples. Tomorrow would require another masterpiece, another performance, another day of being the Gloriana that England needed, rather than the aging woman England would fear. Chapter 4. The ceruse must be prepared more carefully. Elizabeth instructed Lady Margaret the following morning as pale winter light filtered through the leaded windows. "It's too thin. I can feel the air touching my skin through it." Margaret exchanged a glance with Lady Warwick, who was sorting through the Queen's jewellery box for the day's selections, her fingers hovering over rubies and pearls. "Your Majesty," Margaret said carefully. "The mixture is already thicker than usual. Dr. Lopez suggests." "I care little for what Dr. Lopez suggests," Elizabeth cut in, her voice sharp. "The man would have me bathe in goat's milk and crushed pearls if I gave him leave. More ceruse, Margaret. And the belladonna drops for my eyes." "Yes, Your Majesty." Margaret nodded, turning to prepare the mixture with slightly trembling hands. The physicians had been whispering. Elizabeth wasn't deaf, though they sometimes treated her as if her 45 years of rule had reduced her to childish sensibility rather than honing it to razor sharpness. They whispered about the symptoms when they thought she couldn't hear. Headaches, those were nothing new. She'd always had them, ever since those tense days in the tower during her sister's reign. Fatigue made no sense. When had monarchy ever afforded rest? Irritability in a queen wasn't a fault. It was majesty asserting itself. But the faint blue line along her gums that she'd noticed in her looking glass, that was new. And that, she had to admit, was troubling. But to not wear the ceruse? Impossible. It was her face now, had been for decades. The Virgin Queen could not age, much less decay. Elizabeth I was England's mother, its bride, its glorious constant. She couldn't let the mask crack, because the country might follow, fracturing along old religious lines or new political ones. So she added more ceruse, then more. Rouge for colour when her cheeks grew pale beneath the white. Belladonna drops to make her eyes sparkle and widen, though they left her vision blurred for hours afterward. Cloves to sweeten her breath when her blackening teeth made even her counselors wince during close conversations. Every layer was a lie she needed to believe. Every application was a ritual of transformation. "Your Majesty looks radiant today," Cecil said when she received him in her privy chamber that afternoon, seated beneath the canopy of estate in a gown of crimson and gold. His eyes, however, studied her with barely concealed concern. "Flattery, Robert? From you? The sky must be falling." She gestured for him to sit on the cushioned stool nearby, a rare honour. "What news from Scotland? Is our cousin James still writing those tedious treatises on witchcraft?" Cecil briefed her on Scottish affairs, Irish rebellions, French diplomatic overtures, and the never-ending Spanish question. Elizabeth listened with half her attention. The rest focused on not scratching her increasingly irritated skin or revealing how difficult it had become to follow complex conversations when the belladonna blurred more than her vision. "And the succession?" she asked finally, the question that had haunted England for decades, left deliberately unanswered by the Queen, who refused to name an heir. Cecil hesitated, his fingers tightening on the papers in his lap. "All is prepared according to your wishes, Majesty." Elizabeth nodded. They never spoke explicitly of what would happen after her death. To do so would be to admit mortality, hers specifically, but also symbolically England's. The Tudor line would end with her, but England would continue. Must continue. "You are not well, Majesty," Cecil said suddenly, dropping protocol with the directness of long friendship and genuine concern. Elizabeth laughed, a sound that came out harsher than she intended. "Neither is England. I'm speaking of your Majesty's health, not metaphors. And I am speaking of reality, Robert. My health is England's. My face, its banner, and my body." She stopped, removing her glove to scratch an itch on her wrist. When she lifted her hand, a smear of skin came away on the silk. Not dead skin, as from winter dryness, but something softer, wetter, a whisper of rot. Cecil stared, his political mask slipping to reveal genuine alarm, his eyes widening behind his spectacles. Elizabeth replaced her glove calmly, as if nothing unusual had happened. "My body," she continued, "is of no concern compared to the body politic." After Cecil departed, Elizabeth turned back to the French mirror, which she had instructed Margaret to keep uncovered in her chamber despite its disconcerting clarity. She saw it clearly then. She was dying in plain sight, and they called it Majesty. Chapter 5. The truth about Venetian ceruse was both known and deliberately ignored throughout the courts of Europe. White lead and vinegar, applied daily, absorbed through the skin, causing anemia, brain damage, and eventual organ failure. Queens, duchesses, courtiers, and courtesans across the continent slathered it on their faces, necks, and bosoms. Beauty was worth a little poison, they all agreed. But no one used it more religiously than Elizabeth, who had worn it nearly every day for over 40 years. The Spanish ambassador asked if Your Majesty might consider receiving him tomorrow instead. Cecil reported as they strolled in the privy garden, sheltered from the wind by high stone walls. He claims a sudden indisposition. Does he indeed? Elizabeth's voice was sharp with suspicion. What sort of indisposition strikes a man between breakfast and dinner? Has Madrid recalled him so soon? Cecil cleared his throat nervously. He mentioned being unsettled by his audience this morning. Unsettled. Elizabeth tested the word, rolling it around her mouth like a sour plum. By what, precisely? My unwillingness to allow Spanish priests to roam freely through England, converting my subjects to popery. Or perhaps my failure to drop dead after 45 years of his master's waiting. Majesty. Cecil's voice held a note of caution. Tell me honestly, Robert, what did he say? Elizabeth stopped walking, turning to face her trusted advisor directly. Cecil hesitated, clearly weighing loyalty against truth. He said Your Majesty seemed altered. Altered, she repeated flatly. How diplomatic of him. The truth, which neither spoke aloud, was that the morning audience had been disastrous. Elizabeth had swayed on her feet halfway through, her vision swimming with black spots like flies buzzing before her eyes. She'd recovered quickly, covering the moment by demanding a cushion be brought for her feet. But she'd seen the shock on the ambassador's face, not at her momentary weakness. That could happen to anyone, but at what the sudden movement had done to her carefully constructed facade. The ceruse had cracked dramatically across her cheek, revealing the inflamed skin beneath. A trickle of something, not quite blood, not quite pus, had escaped from the corner of her eye, leaving a pinkish trail down to her jaw, before Lady Margaret could whisk her away for adjustments to her appearance. But worse than all this was the fact that the ceruse, despite its poisons, accomplished exactly what Elizabeth required. Portraits depicted her as ageless, ethereal, imperial. Foreign courts feared her calculated inscrutability. Subjects revered her image on coins and proclamations. None could see the decay beneath. They saw only Gloriana, the fairy queen from Spenser's verses. Her image won wars, maintained peace, kept England Protestant, independent, inviolate. So she wore more, even as her hair fell out in alarming clumps, requiring increasingly elaborate wigs, as her teeth blackened and loosened in their sockets, making public speaking an exercise in careful diction. Even when her body protested with mysterious pains, tremors, and dizzy spells that left her clutching at tapestries for support, she wore it like armor, like penance, like faith. I will receive the Spanish ambassador again tomorrow, Elizabeth decided, resuming their walk along the gravel path. At the same hour, let him see that English queens do not falter because of Spanish discomfort. As Your Majesty wishes, Cecil said, bowing his head in acquiescence. After he left, Elizabeth returned to the French mirror, which now dominated her private chamber despite, or perhaps because of, the horror it revealed. Silvered glass, be so kind, she murmured mockingly to herself. What do others see when they look at me? Her reflection stared back, mute and terrible. The right side of her face drooped now, undeniably. The ceruse had taken on a yellowish tinge, where it mixed with the fluid seeping from her skin, and her famous red wig sat slightly askew, revealing a glimpse of sparse white hair and scabbed scalp beneath. Still me, she answered herself, straightening the wig with trembling fingers. Still queen. Chapter 6. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier. It pressed against her scalp with the tyranny of expectation, jewel-studded and unyielding. Elizabeth walked down the corridor toward the great hall, Lady Margaret one pace behind, carrying nothing but composure and a cloth in case the Queen perspired. She would not. Queens did not sweat. "Wait here," Elizabeth murmured, pausing at the threshold. The hall shimmered with torchlight and the heat of bodies gathered to watch her pass, like pilgrims waiting for a relic. She inhaled through her nose. Mistake. The familiar sting of vinegar burned in her sinuses, her vision blurred at the edges. Still, she stepped forward. Every footfall echoed louder than it should have. Her shoes felt too tight. Her ribs ached from the tightened corset, and her stomach churned beneath the weight of brocade and ceremony. But the silence that fell upon the room when she entered, that made it worth it. Gloriana had arrived. 100 courtiers bowed in unison, a ripple of subservience. The Spanish ambassador inclined his head, his expression unreadable. Somewhere, a lute struck a wrong note and fell abruptly silent. Elizabeth kept her spine straight, her chin high, her eyes fixed just above the heads of the assembly. Halfway to the dais, she faltered. A shiver traced her spine. The hall tilted, just slightly. Not enough to stagger, but enough to make her doubt. The air grew thick. She could taste it. Dust, rose oil, sweat, and under it all, that old metallic tang she could never quite place. Voices continued as if nothing had happened, though a beat too slowly. The illusion held. Until it didn't. A whisper. A child's voice, too young to know fear. "Mama, the Queen is melting." Elizabeth stopped. The air fled the room. She inclined her head and felt the skin on her cheek drag unnaturally. Not taut, detached. The paint had buckled. Something warm trickled down the side of her face. A single gasp. Then silence. No one moved. She reached up and touched it. Her fingers came away with a smear of white and pink and something grey. Not blood, not paint. Something worse. She saw it then, not in a mirror, but in the eyes of the court. The reflection she had imposed for decades unraveled. Her majesty, crumbling. Elizabeth turned, not stumbling, not rushing, just turning, and walked out the way she had come. Back through the corridor, past the guards who dared not speak, into her chambers. The doors closed. "Leave me," she said, and Lady Margaret obeyed without a word. Elizabeth stood in front of the looking-glass. The French one, the gift, the betrayal. She removed the crown, then the wig, then peeled the ceruse from her face in great cracking sheets, like paint from old wood, beneath. Red, yellow, grey. Lesions where there should have been skin. Skin where there should have been legend. Her face did not belong to her anymore. She stared, and the woman in the mirror stared back, expressionless, unblinking. Elizabeth reached for the velvet curtain and covered the glass. She said nothing more that night. Not to Margaret, not to God. Just sat beside the cold hearth, hands folded in her lap, crown resting in her lap like a skull, waiting. Chapter 7. In March of 1603, Elizabeth locked herself in her chambers at Richmond Palace, refusing to leave the room where she had spent so many nights planning England's future. Her Majesty will not receive visitors, Lady Margaret informed Cecil when he arrived with urgent council business, her eyes red-rimmed from weeping. She requires seclusion for prayer. "Margaret," Cecil said quietly, drawing her away from the guards posted at the door. "We both know what's happening. How bad is it?" Margaret's eyes, normally as controlled as any courtier's, brimmed suddenly with tears that she hastily wiped away. She will not see her doctors and will not lie down. She will not remove the mask. "God's wounds," Cecil muttered, glancing worriedly at the closed door. "How long has she been standing?" 3 days. Just. Standing there by the window. Sometimes she speaks, but not to us. To her father, I think. Or to Leicester. People long dead. Margaret twisted her handkerchief between her fingers. She speaks of ships and Spanish fire. Cecil tried to peer past Margaret into the royal chamber. She cannot stand forever. She says queens must stand, that England requires it. Margaret's voice dropped further. We've placed cushions nearby for when she falls, but, my lord, I fear the fall will be her end. Her body is so frail beneath all the majesty, Cecil supplied grimly. Beneath all the majesty. For days, Elizabeth remained upright in her chamber, dressed in full court regalia, crown on her wigged head. Like a perfect statue, a ghost. She was the virgin queen that she had created, and had become over decades of rule. Cecil established a rotating guard outside her door, ensuring someone was always available should the Queen call for aid. The council issued statements about the Queen's contemplative seclusion, while frantically finalizing succession arrangements. Physicians waited nearby, though all knew their services would come too late. When the sound of a heavy fall finally came from within the royal chamber, it took Cecil's men only moments to break down the door, wood splintering as they forced their way inside. They found Elizabeth collapsed on the cushions, still in her enormous farthingale and jewels, which had kept her somewhat propped, even in collapse. Her eyes were open but unseeing, her breathing shallow, her white-painted face cracked like a broken porcelain doll. Dr. Lopez knelt beside her, reaching for her wrist to check her pulse, his fingers hesitating just above her skin. "Don't touch me," Elizabeth rasped, her voice barely audible through cracked lips. "Majesty," Cecil said, kneeling awkwardly on her other side, his weak legs protesting. "England needs you well. Please allow the physicians to help." Elizabeth's painted lips twisted in what might have been a smile or a grimace. "England needs me. Inviolate. Perfect. That's what I've given." "Elizabeth," Cecil began, dropping formality in extremis, using the name he had rarely spoken aloud. "No." Her voice suddenly strengthened, as if drawing on some final reserve of the will that had ruled a nation for nearly half a century. "Look at me, Robert. Really look. This is what queenship costs. This is..." She gasped for breath, her chest rising painfully under the weight of jewels and brocade. "I have paid. For England. For all of you. Ingrates." Cecil looked then. Really looked at what decades of ceruse had done. The painted mask was cracking everywhere now, like an old fresco peeling away from its wall. Beneath it, her skin was mottled with angry red lesions and patches of grey-white. Her eyes, once famous for their sharp, dark brilliance, were clouded, the whites yellowish. "I regret nothing," Elizabeth whispered. "I'd do it. Again. Every layer. Every day. A small price for immortality." She closed her eyes then. Her breathing continued, ragged and wet, for several more hours. But Elizabeth Tudor, the queen who had sacrificed her body to maintain her image, spoke no more. Later, the court would pretend she died peacefully. Poetry would be written about her serene passing. History would record a dignified end to a magnificent reign. The truth would be buried with her. Chapter 8. They stripped her body for burial. It was necessary. Royal funeral customs demanded it. But the ladies who performed this final service would carry the memory to their graves. Underneath the paint, lesions, open sores, blackened gums, swollen tongue, patches where skin sloughed away at the slightest touch, hair reduced to isolated tufts on a scalp cross-hatched with scars from wig pins and chemical burns. The icon of England had been rotting alive for years, but none of them had noticed. Or rather, none of them had dared to see. They'd loved the mask too much to acknowledge the woman dying inside it. And so had she. They dressed her corpse in cloth of gold and ermine. These were the royal funeral garments that had been prepared years ago and kept ready. They covered the worst ravages with fresh ceruse, one final application of the poison that had killed her. They placed the imperial crown on a wig more magnificent than any she'd worn in life. When James arrived from Scotland to claim his inheritance, having waited so long for Elizabeth to name him heir, he insisted on viewing his predecessor. History does not record his reaction to the magnificent effigy laid out in Westminster, but those who were present noted he did not linger long at the casket, twisting away to discuss matters of state. Chapter 9. Elizabeth's image lives on in paintings, coins, and legends. The Virgin Queen, Gloriana, the monarch who defeated the Spanish Armada and ushered in England's golden age. What was the truth? Whispers, footnotes in medical texts about the dangers of lead-based cosmetics, occasional academic papers speculating on the real causes of her death. Radiant to the end, they still say of her, these centuries later. In the National Portrait Gallery, tourists crowd around her famous portraits. The Armada portrait with its imperial splendor, the Ditchley portrait with its cosmic symbolism, the Darnley portrait with its enigmatic half-smile. They admire her pale complexion, her elaborate costumes, her seemingly ageless visage through decades of rule. No one sees the horror beneath, the sacrifice, the woman who became the mask that became the legend. And perhaps that's exactly what Elizabeth would have wanted. Her final, most complete victory. To be remembered not as she was, but as she created herself to be. The face that ruled an empire was buried under 6 layers of lead, and not one wrinkle. The price of immortality, paid in full. Author's note. Here is where the story keeps faithful to the record. Venetian ceruse existed, a paste of white lead, vinegar and rosewater that delivered the coveted ghost-pale complexion while quietly lacing its wearers with poison. Long exposure stamped blue lines on wearers' gums. It gave them blackened teeth, cracked skin, weakened nerves, and, in time, shut down organs. Elizabeth's smallpox scars were genuine. She caught the pox in 1560, too. Lived through it, and masked the pitted evidence with makeup for the rest of her reign. 16th century courtiers really used belladonna eye drops. The drug widened pupils and blurred sight, yet vanity trumped vision. Contemporary observers agree that, in March of 1603, Elizabeth refused to lie down, insisted on sitting propped among cushions, and finally collapsed at Richmond Palace. The armada that threatened English shores, the beard Essex dared to wear, the verses Raleigh wrote. The short stature of Robert Cecil and the fact that James Stuart waited in Scotland for the English crown are all well documented. Now for the liberties. Lady Margaret, who keeps the Queen company, is my invention. Elizabeth had a shifting household of ladies-in-waiting, but Margaret gives the monarch someone to confide in who cannot sue me for libel. Dr. Rodrigo Lopez appears in 1603, even though the historical physician was executed for alleged treason in 1594. I kept him alive because no newcomer would know the Queen's body so well. The crystalline mirror said to arrive from Henri IV is a plausible diplomatic gift rather than a recorded one. True mirrors of that clarity were Dutch, French, or Venetian luxuries, but none had Tudor roses carved in for symbolic convenience. Every whispered line of dialogue, each glimpse of private thought, and the frightened child who mutters, "The Queen is melting," comes from me, not the state papers. The symptoms and chronology of lead poisoning have been tightened. 4 decades of slow deterioration would bore any reader, so I condensed that year-long corrosion into one catastrophic evening in the Great Hall. Why linger on decay? Because monarchy is theatre, and Elizabeth understood the stage better than any ruler before her. The white mask persuaded enemies that she was ageless, cowed Spain, dazzled poets, and still it killed her inch by inch. That clash between image and body deserved center stage. Regards. Carey. Historical side effects. Disclaimer. Gloriana edition. This story is for entertainment purposes only. Do not attempt to recreate 16th century beauty routines unless you've made peace with death and questionable fashion choices. Side effects may include toxic glow-ups, flaking pride, chronic virginity branding, and the irresistible urge to assert dominance via powdered face and sharp rhetoric. Extended use of Venetian ceruse may result in skin corrosion, lead poisoning, imperial confidence, ghostly aesthetic, and the complete erasure of visible pores, along with one's natural lifespan. Consult a physician if you experience swelling of the ego, anachronistic feminism, or delusions of eternal monarchy. Side effects may also include Tudor-era gatekeeping, obsession with flattering portraits, and choosing political survival over personal comfort, and wigs. So many wigs. Not safe for courtiers with opinions, suitors with expectations, or anyone standing too close during the summer. Warning. This story contains strong female leadership, weak male heirs, and one crown worn at great cost to skin and soul. Use with caution. May leave a lasting mark on your face, your legacy, or both. This story is based on real history. Yes, people really put white lead on their faces for decades. Yes, it really killed them. Queen Elizabeth wore the mask until it became her skin and her legacy. Want more heinous history? Hit subscribe. New audio stories every week.